The average Egyptian worker ate better than most people in medieval Europe. Bread, beer, onions, dried fish, between 3,000 and 4,000 calories a day, supplied by one of the most productive agricultural systems the ancient world ever built. And yet, when archaeologists examined the bones, the actual skeletons from workers' cemeteries along the Nile, they found spines compressed by decades of heavy lifting. Joints worn smooth before the age of 30. Teeth ground flat, not by age, but by the sand baked into every loaf of bread they ever ate. These people were not starving. They were being used up, fed just well enough to keep working, maintained the way you maintain a tool. That is what daily life looked like in ancient Egypt. Not the gold, not the temples, the sand in the bread, and the body that had no choice but to swallow it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm always curious how far these stories travel. If you want to understand what really happened behind the walls of this civilization, subscribe now. Let's start in the dark. Not the darkness of a tomb. That comes later for everyone, and the Egyptians knew it. This is a different kind of dark, domestic, ordinary. The kind that fills a mud brick house at 4 in the morning in a village where nobody has anywhere to go except back to work. The village is called Deir el-Medina. It sits in a narrow valley on the west bank of the Nile, across the river from Thebes, what we now call Luxor, tucked between the cliffs like something the desert is slowly trying to swallow. Around 1250 BCE, during the long reign of Ramesses II, roughly 60 families live here. Stonecutters, draftsmen, painters, plasterers. The men who build and decorate the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Their wives, their children, their mothers-in-law, their grudges, their debts, their gods. This is a company town. The state built it. The state owns it. The state decides who lives here and what they eat and how much beer they receive on the 3rd day of each 10-day week. The houses are arranged in tight, ordered rows along a single main street, with a perimeter wall that separates the village from the desert on all sides. Nobody chose this layout. Nobody chose this address. You were assigned here because the king needed your hands, and you stayed because leaving was not a concept the system acknowledged. The house we're stepping into is roughly 15 meters long and 5 meters wide. 4 rooms connected in a line. No hallway, no corridor, just one space opening into the next, like vertebrae. The front room faces the street. It has a built-in brick bench along one wall, low enough to sit on, wide enough to sleep on when the house is full. There is a small niche cut into the mud brick, a shrine. We'll come back to that. Behind the front room, a main living space. The ceiling is higher here, supported by a single wooden column, and wood, in a country that has almost none, is a quiet signal of status. This room has a raised platform along one wall, plastered and painted, where the family sleeps during the cooler months. In summer, they drag their mats to the roof. The heat in Upper Egypt between May and September is not a background detail. It reshapes everything. When people wake, when they work, when they eat, where they sleep, how they think. A mud brick house absorbs the day's heat and releases it slowly through the night, which means that by 3 or 4 in the morning, the walls are still warm and the air inside is thick and still and tastes faintly of old cooking smoke. Behind the living space, a smaller room. Behind that, a kitchen, open to the sky or partially roofed, with a clay oven, grain storage bins, and a set of grinding stones that we will spend some time with, because those stones are going to tell us more about daily life in Egypt than any statue or temple inscription ever could. And beneath the kitchen floor, dug into the bedrock, a cellar. Cool, dark, locked, grain, dried fish, oil, the household survival measured in jars. Archaeologists have excavated dozens of these houses. The floor plans are remarkably consistent. The state standardized even the shape of private life. But inside that uniformity, people pushed back in small ways. Some families painted their walls, bright yellows, deep reds, images of the dwarf figure Bes, who, in their belief system, protected the household against malevolent forces, particularly during childbirth and sleep. One house had a painted scene of a woman nursing a child, rendered with a tenderness that feels almost startling against the raw mud brick. Another had geometric patterns on the ceiling, red and blue, applied with care by someone who clearly wanted their 4 rooms to feel like more than what the state had issued. These were not wealthy people. They were skilled workers, yes, and relatively privileged compared to field laborers or quarry crews. But their houses were assigned, their rations were calculated, and their movements were recorded by a scribe who lived in the village and whose job every single day was to write down who was present and who was not. Now, the shrine. Almost every house at Deir el-Medina contained a small domestic shrine, usually in the front room, sometimes built into the wall, sometimes freestanding on a low bench. Archaeologists have found stelae, small painted stone tablets dedicated to household protective figures. Bes, with his grotesque face and squat body, believed to ward off evil spirits. Tawarid, the hippo goddess, associated in their understanding with safe childbirth. Small clay figurines, broken pottery that had been used for offerings, traces of incense, burned, as far as we can tell, daily. I want to be precise about what this was. This was not casual. This was not decorative. In the Egyptian worldview, the boundary between the living and the hostile forces of chaos was thin, and it was thinnest inside the home, where children were born, where people slept, where the body was most vulnerable. The shrine was a defense perimeter. The prayers spoken there, the incense burned, the offerings placed. These were, as the Egyptians understood them, functional, as real and as necessary as locking a door. And the thing that strikes me, after years with these sources, after handling some of these small votives in storage rooms where they've sat for a century waiting for someone to care, the thing that stays is how intimate this was. The great temples at Karnak and Luxor were public performances of divine power, built to overwhelm. The household shrine was something else. It was a private negotiation. A family in a 4-room house they didn't own, in a village they couldn't leave, kneeling in front of a clay figure and asking, quietly in the dark before anyone else was awake, for one more safe day. The cynical reading is that belief was another tool of control. The state told them what to think, and they thought it. I've considered that reading. I don't think it's entirely wrong. A broken amulet that should have been. A broken amulet that should have been discarded. The system shaped belief, yes, but belief, once inside a person, developed its own architecture. Rooms the state never designed and couldn't inspect. Before dawn, the woman of the house is already awake. We know this because of the bread. The bread had to be made fresh or close to fresh every single day. And making bread in ancient Egypt was not what that phrase means now. It was a full-body, multi-hour physical ordeal that began in the dark and ended, if it ended, sometime in the mid-morning. The process started with grain. Emmer wheat stored in the cellar or in large ceramic jars, sealed against mice and insects. The grain had to be pounded first to separate it from its tough husk, then ground into flour on a saddle quern, a heavy stone slab with a rounded handstone rubbed back and forth across its surface, over and over for hours. This was women's work. We know because the tomb paintings show it, women kneeling at the grinding stone, leaning forward, pushing with both arms, and because the skeletons confirm it. Bioarchaeological studies of female remains from workers' communities across Egypt show a pattern so consistent it functions almost as a signature. Severe degenerative arthritis in the knees, ankles and toes from the kneeling posture. Extensive damage to the lumbar spine from the repetitive forward-leaning motion, and shoulders worn in ways that suggest thousands of hours of the same grinding arc. These women's bodies were shaped by bread, and the bread itself carried its own cost. The flour was never fully clean. Microscopic analysis of Egyptian bread, actual preserved loaves recovered from tombs and settlement sites, reveals particles of sand, wind-blown grit, and fragments of stone from the grinding surface itself embedded in the dough. This is why Egyptian teeth look the way they do. Not cavities. Where? The molars are ground flat, sometimes down to the root, by a lifetime of chewing bread that contained purite and silica. Dental abscesses were epidemic. Infections that started in the jaw could spread, and in a world without antibiotics, a tooth could kill. I keep returning to this detail because it contains something I think most documentaries about Egypt miss entirely. This was a civilization capable of extraordinary engineering, extraordinary art, extraordinary administrative precision. They tracked every sack of grain, every copper chisel, every man-hour of labor with a diligence that would impress a modern accountant. And yet, the bread had sand in it every day for 3,000 years. Not because they didn't notice, they noticed. Texts describe the problem. They simply couldn't solve it, not with the tools they had, and so the sand became part of the system. Accepted, absorbed, ground into the teeth of every person who ever lived along the Nile. That is daily life. Not the grand failure, not the dramatic catastrophe, the small, permanent grinding thing that nobody fixed because fixing it was not how the system thought. The beer was next, and beer in Egypt was not what you're imagining. It was thick, closer to a fermented porridge than anything you'd recognize from a glass. Made from partially baked bread, crumbled into water, mixed with dates for sweetness, and left to ferment. The result was nutritious, mildly alcoholic, rich in B vitamins, and consumed by virtually everyone: men, women, children, priests, soldiers, scribes. Residue analysis from beer jars found at multiple sites confirms the basic recipe, with regional variations. Some added coriander, some added juniper, some strained the liquid more carefully than others. Beer was not leisure. Beer was infrastructure. It provided hydration in a climate where water from the Nile carried parasites, a fact the Egyptians couldn't have understood in microbial terms, though they clearly understood the consequences because medical texts describe the symptoms in detail. It supplemented calories. It was issued as part of the daily ration, measured and recorded by the same scribes who tracked attendance and tool distribution. In their belief system, beer was sacred, associated with Hathor, whom they understood as a force of joy, fertility, and celebration. But on the ground, in the village, at 5 in the morning, beer was breakfast. By the time the first light reaches the village, a thin copper line along the eastern cliffs, the house is already in motion. The bread is baking, the beer is poured. Children are stirring on the roof or on the sleeping platform. The man of the house, the stone cutter, the painter, the plasterer, is preparing for the walk. Not a short walk. The path from Deir el-Medina to the Valley of the Kings crosses a mountain ridge, climbs through a narrow pass, and descends into the valley on the other side. It takes roughly 45 minutes in the cool of the morning. In the heat, longer. He carries his tools, a water skin, maybe a packed lunch, bread, onions, dried fish wrapped in a cloth. He will not return until the end of his work shift, which lasts 8 days. He sleeps in stone huts near the tomb site. His wife will not see him until his 2 rest days. The children will not see their father for more than 2 days out of every 10. And nobody writes about this. Not the scribes, not the administrators, not the priests. The absence is 8 days out of 10, and the record treats it as ordinary, which of course it was. Here is a number, remember it. 5.5 car of emmer wheat, 2 car of barley, per month, per senior workman. That was the wage, not in silver, not in copper, not in any abstraction that pretended to represent value. Grain. Measured, recorded, distributed from state granaries by scribes who wrote down every transaction on papyrus and limestone flakes with a meticulousness that borders, at this distance, on the obsessive. We know these numbers because the Egyptians could not stop writing things down. Administrative ostraca, broken pieces of limestone and pottery used as cheap notepads, survive from Deir el-Medina in the thousands. Thousands. Ration lists, attendance sheets, tool inventories, delivery receipts, complaint letters, judicial proceedings, and the occasional doodle by a bored scribe who was, presumably, having a slow afternoon. The sheer volume of bureaucratic debris tells us something the monuments never could. This was a civilization that believed, down to its administrative bones, that if something wasn't recorded, it didn't count. A junior workman received less than a senior one. A scribe received more than both. The foreman received the most, plus additional allotments of meat, oil, and natron salt during festivals. The ratios were fixed. The hierarchy was edible. You could taste your rank every morning in the thickness of your bread and the quantity of your beer, and everyone in the village knew exactly what everyone else was getting, because the distributions were public and the records were available to anyone who could read, which, in a village of scribes and craftsmen, was a significant number. But grain is not food until someone transforms it. And that transformation, let me be blunt about this, was a form of daily physical destruction that fell almost entirely on women. I described the grinding stones in part 1. Now let me describe what they did to a body over time, because the skeletal evidence is extensive and it is not subtle. Dr. Eugen Strauhals. Studies of human remains from Egyptian workers' communities and similar bioarchaeological work across multiple sites document a pattern in adult female skeletons that reads like a catalogue of repetitive strain. The cervical vertebrae show compression. The lumbar spine shows advanced degenerative disc disease, often by the later 20s. The knee joints show erosion consistent with prolonged kneeling on hard surfaces. The toe joints are arthritic, sometimes fused. The shoulders, particularly the right shoulder in most cases, show asymmetric wear from the grinding motion. The same arc, repeated thousands of times per day for years. These were not old women. Many of these skeletons belonged to individuals who died in their 30s. And I should be careful here, because the temptation is to impose a modern emotional framework. To say this was exploitation or cruelty or injustice. Those words carry assumptions about intention that the evidence doesn't support. The Egyptians did not grind grain this way because they wanted to destroy women's bodies. They ground grain this way because this was the technology they had. Rotary mills, the kind that would eventually reduce the labor, didn't appear in Egypt until the Ptolemaic period, more than 1,000 years after the village at Deir el-Medina was built. For the entire span of pharaonic civilization, from the Old Kingdom to the New, the primary method of flour production was a woman on her knees, pushing a stone. Not cruelty. Something worse, maybe. Indifference built into the physics of the task. The bread that came out of this process was flat, round and dense, baked in clay ovens, conical structures heated with straw, animal dung or whatever fuel was available. The loaves varied in quality depending on how finely the flour had been sifted. Elite households, which had access to finer sieves and more labor, produced lighter bread. Workers' families produced what they could. And all of it, every single loaf, from the finest temple offering to the roughest field ration, contained grit. This is measurable. Forensic analysis of preserved Egyptian bread, conducted by multiple research teams across different institutions, consistently identifies particles of it, quartz, feldspar, and stone fragments within the crumb structure. Some of this came from the grinding stones themselves. As the quern wore down, microscopic fragments of stone broke off and mixed into the flour. Some came from the grain, wind-blown desert sand lodged in the husks during harvest and threshing, impossible to remove entirely. Some came from the ovens, from the ash, from the environment itself. Egypt is a country made of sand, and the sand got into everything, including, especially, the one thing every person ate every day. The dental evidence is, if anything, more striking than the skeletal evidence. Egyptian teeth do not decay in the patterns modern dentists recognize. They wear. The occlusal surfaces, the biting surfaces of the molars, are ground flat, sometimes obliterated entirely, exposing the pulp cavity and leading to abscesses that could and did become fatal. This pattern appears across all social classes, though it's most extreme in workers and farmers who ate coarser bread. Even royal mummies show significant dental attrition. Ramesses II, who reigned for 67 years and whose mummy is one of the best preserved in the world, had teeth worn nearly to the jawline. I think about this more than I probably should. A civilization that built the Karnak temple complex, that moved stones weighing hundreds of tons with mathematical precision, could not get the sand out of its bread. There is something in that gap between what the Egyptians could engineer and what they could not fix that I find more revealing than any inscription. The grand projects worked because the state could concentrate resources, command labor, and dedicate generations to a single structure. The bread didn't improve because bread was everybody's problem and nobody's project. The system optimized what the system valued. Bodies were not what the system valued. Now, the medical texts. The Egyptians knew their people were breaking down. This is not speculation. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical compendium dated to roughly 1550 BCE, though it likely compiles knowledge from much earlier periods, runs to over 20 meters in length and contains more than 700 remedies for conditions ranging from eye infections to intestinal parasites to what appears to be clinical depression. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, probably slightly older, takes a different approach. It's structured as a surgical manual, working systematically from head to toe, describing injuries, diagnoses, and treatments with a clinical precision that still impresses medical historians. Some of these treatments were effective. Honey, used as a wound dressing, has genuine antiseptic properties, a fact the Egyptians observed empirically long before anyone understood why. Willow bark, prescribed for pain, contains a compound related to modern aspirin. Splints for broken bones, sutures for wounds, recommendations for rest, for dietary changes, for the application of specific poultices made from plants whose active compounds have, in some cases, been validated by modern pharmacology. And some of the treatments were, well, a remedy for baldness in the Ebers Papyrus calls for a mixture of fats from a hippopotamus, a crocodile, a cat, a snake, and an ibex applied to the scalp. A treatment for eye disease involves the urine of a faithful wife. I don't say this to mock. I say it because the medical texts contain both approaches, the rational and the ritualistic, side by side without any apparent sense of contradiction. In the Egyptian understanding, disease had physical causes and spiritual dimensions simultaneously. A parasitic infection might require a herbal remedy and an incantation spoken over the patient's body because the illness existed, as they saw it, in both realms at once. Separating the two would have made no sense to them. It would have been like treating half a person. The diseases themselves were relentless. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection contracted through contact with Nile water, was so prevalent that some scholars have argued it affected the majority of the population along the river. The parasite's eggs have been identified in mummified tissue. The symptoms, chronic fatigue, abdominal pain, blood in the urine, appear described, if obliquely, in medical texts. Malaria, tuberculosis, polio, intestinal parasites of multiple varieties, eye diseases, trachoma likely, so common that they show up in administrative records as a standard reason for workplace absence. A scribe at Deir el-Medina recording why a man missed his shift would write, without evident surprise, his eyes. His eyes. 2 words. And behind them, a man sitting in a dark room with an infection he can't cure, in a village he can't leave, waiting for his body to decide whether he works tomorrow or not. The state provided medical care, of a kind. There were physicians attached to the workforce, and references in the administrative documents suggest that sick workers received their rations even during periods of absence, at least for a time. This was not compassion, or not only compassion. It was resource management. A trained stonecutter represented years of invested labor. Letting him die of an untreated infection was wasteful. The same logic that failed to fix the bread succeeded intermittently at fixing the worker, because the worker was a unit the system tracked. I've read the absence records from Deir el-Medina many times, And what accumulates is not any single tragic entry, but the texture of the whole. The reasons for missing work, logged day after day, year after year, form a strange and accidentally intimate portrait of an entire community's physical life. Scorpion sting, brewing beer, eye disease, embalming his mother, his wife is bleeding. That last one appears multiple times, a reference to menstruation recorded without comment as a routine cause of a man's absence. Whether this reflects a taboo that kept men home during their wives' periods, or a practical need for the husband to take over domestic duties, or something else entirely, the sources don't say. The scribe wrote it down because the scribe wrote everything down. The meaning behind the notation is ours to guess at. And here is where I should admit something. The picture I'm building of worn-down bodies, sand-damaged teeth, parasitic infections and chronic pain is accurate, but it is not complete. It risks turning these people into victims, which is a different kind of distortion. The workers at Deir el-Medina were also, by the standards of the ancient world, comparatively fortunate. They were fed by the state, they had housing, they had access to medical care. They were literate, many of them could read and write, a skill that placed them above the vast majority of the Egyptian population. Their children had a reasonable chance of inheriting their father's positions. They celebrated festivals, drank extra beer on holidays, and, as we'll see, sued each other with an enthusiasm that suggests a robust sense of personal rights. Calling them oppressed is too simple. Calling them privileged is too generous. They lived inside a system that provided for them precisely to the degree that it needed them, and not one measure more. The bread kept them alive. The sand in the bread wore them down. Both things were true at the same time, administered by the same bureaucracy, recorded by the same scribe. That is what a ration system looks like from the inside. Not starvation, not abundance, maintenance. The path is still there. 3,200 years later, you can walk it. The same mountain trail the workmen of Deir el-Medina climbed every 10-day cycle to reach the Valley of the Kings. It cuts over a limestone ridge, through a narrow saddle between two peaks, and drops into the valley on the western side. 45 minutes in the early morning when the rock is cool and the air is dry. Longer when the sun is overhead. Much longer if your knees are already damaged and you're carrying copper chisels in a leather bag and the man ahead of you is coughing. They walked this in groups. Not because they chose to, because the system moved them in units. The entire workforce was divided into two gangs, the right side and the left side, corresponding to the two halves of whatever royal tomb was under construction at the time. Each gang had a foreman, a deputy foreman, and a scribe. The scribe carried the attendance register. He walked with them because his job began the moment the shift started. Who was present, who was late, who had sent word of illness, who had simply not appeared. The huts where they slept during their 8-day work shifts still survive. Small dry stone structures clustered on the ridge above the valley, just large enough for a man to lie down. No furniture, no decoration. A mat, a headrest, a water jar. The huts had no doors, just narrow openings that faced away from the prevailing wind. At night, the desert cold at altitude could be sharp, and these men slept in the same linen kilts they worked in, because nobody had packed a second set of clothes for the week. I want to stop on that image for a moment. These were the men who created some of the most extraordinary art in human history. The painted chambers of Tutankhamun's tomb, the vast decorated corridors of the tomb of Seti I, the elaborate cosmic ceilings of Ramesses VI. All of it was made by men who spent their work weeks sleeping in stone huts on a mountainside, eating packed bread and onions, and walking home every 10th day to see their families. The gap between what they produced and how they lived is one of those things I still haven't fully reconciled after 20 years with these records. Maybe it doesn't reconcile. Maybe that's the point. The workday began at dawn and ran until mid-afternoon, with a break around midday for food and rest. We know this from the same administrative ostraca that tracked everything else. Timesheets, essentially, noting when work started and when it stopped. The tools were state-issued: copper chisels, wooden mallets, stone hammers, plumb bobs, string lines, reed brushes, mineral pigments ground into cakes. Every tool was inventoried. Every chisel was weighed at issue and weighed again at return, because copper was expensive and the state wanted to know exactly how much metal had been lost to wear. If the numbers didn't balance, someone had to account for the difference. The work itself was sequential and collaborative. First, the quarrymen cut the rock, hacking into the limestone with copper and stone tools, working by the light of oil lamps in corridors that grew deeper and darker with each passing month. Behind them came the plasterers, smoothing the rough-cut walls with layers of gypsum and mud plaster. Behind the plasterers, the draftsmen, who sketched the preliminary designs onto the walls using red ink and a grid system that ensured correct proportions. Behind the draftsmen, the sculptors who carved the reliefs. And finally, the painters who applied pigment, ground minerals mixed with gum arabic or egg white to bring the scenes to life. Each step depended on the one before it. A delay in quarrying pushed back the plasterers. A mistake in drafting meant the sculptors carved the wrong outline. A bad batch of plaster meant the paint would flake within a decade. The coordination required was considerable, and the foremen who managed it were experienced craftsmen themselves, men who had risen through the ranks over years, who understood every stage of the process because they had done every stage of the process. And yet, the foreman's authority was not absolute. It was checked from above by the scribe and from below by the workers themselves. The Egyptians had, at Deir el-Medina at least, something that functioned remarkably like a labor grievance system. Workers could and did bring complaints against their foreman to a local tribunal called the Kenbet, a council of senior workmen and scribes that heard disputes, examined evidence, and issued rulings. The records of these proceedings survive, and they are, there is no other word for this, riveting. The most famous case involves a foreman named Paneb. Paneb, son of Nefersenut, rose to the position of chief workman on the right side of the gang sometime during the reign of Seti II, around 1200 BCE. The circumstances of his appointment were already disputed. A rival claimed Paneb had obtained the position through bribery, paying off a senior official named Primhab with a gift of 5 servants. Whether this was true or fabricated by a bitter competitor, we cannot know for certain. But the accusation was only the beginning. Over the following years, a dossier of charges accumulated against Paneb, preserved on a papyrus now known as Papyrus Salt 124, currently in the British Museum. The accusations are extraordinary in their specificity. He allegedly stole stone from the royal tomb for use in his own burial chamber. He reportedly took state-issued tools and never returned them. He purportedly sat on the sarcophagus of the reigning pharaoh, an act of sacrilege so brazen it's difficult to know whether to read it as defiance or drunkenness. He was accused of adultery, not once but with multiple women in the village, including the wife of at least one subordinate. He allegedly chased a man through the village at night with the intention of killing him. He was accused of stripping workers of their clothing, whether as punishment or humiliation the text doesn't clarify. The charges read like a small-town crime blotter, compressed into a single devastating document. And what makes the Paneb case so valuable, beyond its sheer drama, is what it reveals about the social machinery of the village. These were not anonymous complaints lodged with a distant authority. These were neighbors accusing a neighbor. Men who slept in adjacent huts on the mountain, whose children played together in the village street, whose wives borrowed grain from each other during lean months. The intimacy of the accusations reflects the intimacy of the community. Everyone knew everything. Privacy in a village of 60 families enclosed by a wall in the desert was a concept with very limited application. The outcome of Paneb's case is unclear. The record breaks off, as Egyptian records often do, at the moment you most want to know what happened next. Some scholars believe he was removed from office. Others think he survived the accusations and continued as foreman. The ambiguity is frustrating, and I won't pretend otherwise, but the incompleteness of the record is itself a kind of evidence, a reminder that we are working with fragments and that the stories we reconstruct are bounded by what the desert chose to preserve and what it chose to swallow. What the Paneb case confirms more broadly is that the worksite was not a place of silent obedience. The image of Egyptian laborers as mute, beaten masses, an image that owes more to Hollywood than to any primary source, collapses entirely under the weight of the Deir el-Medina archive. These workers complained, constantly, formally, in writing. They filed grievances, demanded arbitration, and, in at least one extraordinary instance, went on strike. The Turin strike papyrus, dated to year 29 of Ramesses III, roughly 1152 BCE, records the event with bureaucratic precision. The workers' rations had not arrived. The granaries were empty, or the distribution system had failed, or someone in the supply chain had diverted the grain. The papyrus doesn't specify the cause, only the consequence. The workmen stopped working. They left the Valley of the Kings, marched to the mortuary temples on the plain below, and sat down. "We have been hungry," they told the administrators. 18 days of this month have passed, and we have not been given our rations." They did not frame this as rebellion. That distinction matters. They framed it as a failure of the system to uphold its own obligations. The state owed them grain. The grain had not come. They were not refusing to work. They were refusing to work for free. The logic was contractual, even if no one would have used that word. And the administrators, after some delay, and what the papyrus describes with careful understatement as discussions, eventually provided the missing rations. The men went back to work. This happened more than once. The same papyrus and related documents record multiple work stoppages during the later reign of Ramesses III, a period when the Egyptian state was under increasing financial and military pressure from external threats and internal corruption. The supply system that had functioned reliably for centuries was beginning to crack, and the workers at Deir el-Medina, who depended entirely on that system for survival, were among the first to feel it. Think about what that means for a moment. Not the grand narrative of imperial decline. You can read that anywhere. Think about what it felt like to be a man whose only source of food was the state, whose family could not eat unless a bureaucrat authorized a delivery, standing in front of a temple built to honor a dead king and saying out loud that the system had failed. The courage that required was not dramatic, it was desperate. These men had no alternative income, no private land, no market economy to fall back on. They had their labor and the state's promise. When the promise broke, they had nothing except the willingness to sit down and refuse. And this, not the pyramids, not the gold mask, not the painted tombs. This is what I think about when someone says, ancient Egypt. A man sitting in the dust outside a granary, hungry, waiting for the system to remember he exists. But the system, most of the time, did function. That's the harder truth. The strike is dramatic because it was exceptional. For the vast majority of the village's roughly 400-year existence, the grain arrived. The tools were distributed. The work proceeded. The tombs were carved and painted and sealed. The men walked back over the mountain every 10th day, and their wives had bread waiting, made from grain the state provided, ground on stones that wore the women's bodies into shapes the medical texts tried and mostly failed to repair. The regularity is what defined daily life, not the crisis. The regularity. At the worksite, the days accumulated into weeks, the weeks into months, the months into years. A man might spend his entire career, 30 years, 40 years, cutting and decorating the same type of corridor in the same valley for a succession of kings whose names changed but whose tombs followed the same basic plan. The artistry was extraordinary, the repetition was total, and the names of the men who did the work appear almost nowhere in the tombs they built. That silence is deliberate. The tomb belonged to the king. The art served the king's journey through the afterlife, as the Egyptians understood it. The craftsman's identity was irrelevant to the tomb's function, and so it was erased not by violence, but by the simple logic of a system that valued the product and not the hand. A few names survive on ostraca, on private stelae in the village, in the records of disputes and ration distributions. But inside the tombs themselves, inside the rooms these men spent their lives creating, they are ghosts. I don't know what that does to a person over the span of a career. I've thought about it. I don't have an answer. Roughly 1 in 3. That's the number. 1 in 3 children born along the Nile during the New Kingdom did not survive to age 5. Some estimates push higher, closer to 40% in certain periods and certain communities, depending on which cemetery population you study and how you interpret the skeletal aging methods. The margin of error in these calculations is wide enough to drive a chariot through, and I won't pretend otherwise, but the direction of the evidence is consistent. Egyptian children died young, they died often, and the silence around those deaths in the official record is almost total. The tombs of the powerful do not discuss infant mortality. The administrative papyri record births only when they affect labor allocation. A man absent because his wife is in labor, a woman added to a household register. The monumental inscriptions celebrate royal sons who survived to adulthood and ignore the ones who didn't. To find the children who died, you have to go where the Egyptians put them. In the ground, at the edges of cemeteries, sometimes beneath the floors of houses, wrapped in linen and placed in baskets or repurposed storage jars, without coffins, without names, without the elaborate funerary preparations that older individuals received. Archaeologists at Deir el-Medina and other settlement sites have found infant burials tucked under thresholds, beneath courtyard walls, inside shallow pits scooped from the dry ground behind houses. The bodies are small, some are newborns, some show signs of developmental abnormalities. Many show no visible cause of death at all, which is its own kind of information. The things that killed infants in the ancient world were overwhelmingly infectious, leaving no trace on bone. And then there are the objects buried with them. Amulets, small faience beads, a clay rattle. In one case, a single blue bead placed in an infant's hand, a color the Egyptians associated, in their understanding of the cosmos, with rebirth and divine protection. These are not the grave goods of the wealthy. They are the offerings of parents who had almost nothing to give and gave what they had. I don't want to sentimentalize this. The temptation is enormous and I'm not immune to it. But I also think the opposite impulse, the scholarly reflex to keep emotional distance, to talk about mortality rates and demographic models, can be its own kind of dishonesty. These were children. They were held. They were buried by people whose grief the record does not contain, but whose actions, the bead, the amulet, the careful wrapping, make visible. What the Egyptians did talk about extensively was the fear that surrounded pregnancy and childbirth. In their belief system, this was the most dangerous threshold a family could cross. The mother's body was vulnerable. The child's survival was uncertain. Hostile forces, demons, spirits, envious dead, were believed to gather around the birth, looking for a way in. The protections deployed against these forces were layered and specific. Ivory wands, curved, carved with images of protective beings, lions and serpents and composite creatures, were placed across the mother's body during labor. Spells from texts like the Papyrus Westcar and various collections of magical incantations were spoken aloud by someone trained in the words. The household shrine was activated. Bes and Taweret, the protectors of the domestic sphere as the Egyptians understood them, were invoked by name. The birthing took place at home, often in a special area, sometimes on the roof or in a structure built adjacent to the house. Birthing bricks, painted mud bricks on which the mother squatted during delivery, have been found at Abydos, decorated with scenes of mother and child flanked by protective figures. The bricks themselves functioned, in the Egyptian worldview, as sacred objects, the place where new life crossed from one state of being to another. Whether midwives were formally trained or simply experienced women from the community, the texts don't fully clarify. Probably both, depending on the period and the place. And when things went wrong, which they did with a frequency that the skeletal record confirms, the medical texts offered what they could. The Ebers Papyrus contains remedies for complications during labor, for milk that won't flow, for fevers after birth. Some of these remedies were herbal and potentially effective, others were incantatory. The Egyptians did not distinguish between these categories the way we do. In their framework, a spell and a poultice operated on different aspects of the same problem, and withholding either would have been negligent. The children who survived infancy entered a world that was, and this is the part that complicates every narrative about Egyptian harshness, surprisingly attentive to childhood as a distinct phase of life. Tomb paintings show children playing, swimming in canals, wrestling, pulling each other's hair in ways that look immediately familiar across 3,000 years. Toys have been recovered from domestic contexts across Egypt. Spinning tops made of glazed faience, leather balls stuffed with barley husks, dolls with jointed limbs and real hair, miniature wooden animals on wheeled platforms that could be pulled on a string. Someone made these. Someone watched a child play with them. The objects survived because the desert is dry and the mud brick houses sealed themselves over centuries. But the moments they represent, a parent watching a child drag a wooden horse across a courtyard, those are extrapolations. True ones, I think. But extrapolations. For boys destined for the scribal profession, education began around age 4 or 5. We know the curriculum because the practice texts survive. Schoolboy exercises on ostraca and papyri, the same passages copied out again and again in increasingly legible handwriting. The papyrus lansing, the satire of the trades, the instructions of Amenemope. These texts served a dual purpose. They taught literacy and they taught ideology. The satire of the trades, which students copied so many times that multiple versions survive in varying states of legibility, describes every non-scribal profession as miserable. The washerman handles dirty linen and menstrual cloths. The fisherman is eaten by crocodiles. The soldier is beaten and marched through the desert. The farmer's fingers are covered in sores. Only the scribe, clean, comfortable, respected, escapes the general wretchedness. The propaganda is transparent, and it worked. Scribal training produced not just literate administrators, but loyal ones, men who had internalized, from the age of 5, the belief that their position within the system was the only position worth holding. The curriculum didn't just teach writing, it taught gratitude for being allowed to write. For children who did not enter scribal training, the majority, education was practical and familial. Boys learned their father's trades. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers. Bread making, weaving, beer brewing, the management of a household economy that operated on barter, stored grain, and careful negotiation with neighbors. Formal schooling was rare outside the elite and the skilled trades. Most Egyptians lived and died without being able to read the inscriptions that covered their temples, their tombs, and the administrative documents that governed every aspect of their lives. That fact, the mass illiteracy of a civilization famous for its writing, is one I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The hieroglyphs that tourists photograph on temple walls were, for the overwhelming majority of the people who walked past them, unreadable. The spells inscribed inside coffins meant to guide the dead through the afterlife were inaccessible to most of the dead. The administrative system that tracked every grain ration and every work absence operated in a language that most of the people it tracked could not read. Literacy was power, not metaphorically but functionally. The ability to read and write was the primary mechanism of social mobility in Egyptian society, and access to that mechanism was controlled from childhood by the system itself. Now, the river. Everything I've described so far, The houses, the bread, the rations, the work sites, the children's toys and the children's graves, all of it existed because of one geographical fact. The Nile flooded once a year between June and September, depositing a thin layer of rich black silt across the floodplain. That silt made agriculture possible in a country that receives, in most regions, less than 25 millimeters of rainfall per year. Without the flood, there was no grain. Without grain, there was no bread, no beer, no rations, no workforce, no tombs, no empire. The entire civilization was a footnote to the river. The Egyptians organized their calendar around this fact. 3 seasons. Akhet, the inundation, when the floodwaters covered the fields and agricultural labor ceased. Pereh, the emergence, when the waters receded and planting began. Shemu, the harvest, when the grain was cut, threshed and stored. Every activity, every festival, every administrative cycle was calibrated to this rhythm. The river was not a feature of the landscape, it was the clock. And like any clock, it was not perfectly reliable. Nilometers, stone gauges built into temple walls and river embankments at sites like Elephantine and Rhoda, measured the height of the annual flood. Priests and administrators monitored these readings with intense anxiety, because the difference between a good flood and a bad one was the difference between a fed population and a famine. A flood that was too low left the upper fields dry and the harvest short. A flood that was too high destroyed irrigation channels, drowned livestock, and swept away villages built too close to the water's edge. The margin between prosperity and catastrophe was, in some years, a matter of cubits. The corvée system, compulsory state labor, owed by every able-bodied man during the inundation when agricultural work was impossible, provided the workforce for maintaining the irrigation infrastructure. Canals, dikes, drainage channels, retention basins. The network was vast and required annual repair because the same flood that fed the fields also damaged the channels that directed the water. Administrative texts record the mobilization of corvée labor in terms that sound administrative, but describe something closer to conscription. Men called by name, assigned to specific projects, fed by the state for the duration of their service, and returned to their villages when the work was complete. This was not optional. The language of the administrative texts does not include a mechanism for refusal. You were called and you went, and if you did not go, the scribe wrote down your name and the system, eventually with the grinding patience that characterized Egyptian bureaucracy, caught up with you. The penalties for evasion are not well documented in every period, but references in legal texts suggest they could include corporal punishment, additional labor obligations, or the reassignment of the evader's family members in his place. The river also killed. This is easy to forget when describing the Nile's role as the source of Egyptian civilization. But the people who lived along it did not forget. Crocodiles were a constant threat, present in canals, irrigation channels, and the river itself, large enough and aggressive enough to take a child wading in shallow water or a woman washing clothes at the bank. Hippos, which modern audiences tend to think of as comical, were among the most dangerous animals in the Egyptian environment, territorial, unpredictable, capable of capsizing small boats and killing the occupants. Tomb scenes show fishermen and boatmen in the marshes, and medical texts describe treatments for injuries consistent with animal attacks. Drowning was common enough to appear in literary and religious texts as a recognized category of death. And then there were the parasites. The Nile was not clean water in any modern sense. It carried schistosomiasis, a parasitic flatworm that enters the body through the skin during contact with contaminated water. Wading in fields, washing in canals, swimming as children, every routine interaction with the water carried the risk of infection. The parasite's eggs have been identified in mummified tissue from multiple periods, and the symptoms? Chronic fatigue, abdominal pain, organ damage over time appear described in medical papyri, though the Egyptians would not have understood the cause in parasitological terms. They knew the water could make you sick. They used the water anyway because there was no alternative. The Nile was the only water there was. A single image keeps coming back to me when I think about the river's role in daily life: a tomb painting. I've seen it reproduced dozens of times, and once in person in a publication archive that smelled of old paper and dry adhesive, showing a family fishing from a small papyrus boat in the marshes. The man stands with a throwing stick. His wife sits behind him. A child clings to his leg. The water beneath them is painted with fish and lotus flowers and, in the lower register, a crocodile. The scene is meant to depict leisure, a pleasant family outing in the marshes. But the crocodile is there. The painter put it there, and the child is holding on. The men come back over the mountain on the 9th day. You can see the path from the village, a pale scar across the limestone ridge, visible from the rooftops where the women have been sleeping, where the children have been playing, where the household has functioned for 8 days without the person the state considers its primary unit. The women who ran these households during the 8-day absences are largely invisible in the administrative record, which is itself a kind of testimony. The system tracked the men because the men belong to the state. The women belong to the household, and the household, as far as the scribes were concerned, was not a category that required daily monitoring. But the women managed everything: the grain stores, the barter economy that operated between houses, bread for sandals, beer for laundry services, oil for linen, the children, the sick, the elderly, the shrine, the grinding, the cooking. The social negotiations that kept a village of 60 families from destroying itself during the long stretches when the men were gone and the walls were close and the desert was on every side. And on the 9th day, the men return and the village changes. The rhythm shifts. The evening fills. What did an Egyptian evening look like? Not the royal banquet scenes painted in elite tombs. Those are aspirational, idealized, staged for eternity. I mean an ordinary evening in an ordinary village when the work was done, and the bread was eaten, and the beer was poured, and the sun was dropping behind the western cliffs, and the heat was finally beginning to ease. The cooking fires would have been lit in the open kitchens at the backs of the houses or on the rooftops. The evening meal was simpler than the morning preparation. Bread left from the day's baking, onions, maybe dried or salted fish, lentils or beans cooked in a clay pot over embers. During festivals, the rations expanded. Fresh meat, additional beer, sometimes wine. Festival calendars survive, and they are extensive. The Egyptians celebrated with a regularity that suggests the system understood, at some level, that people who are never permitted to rest eventually stop functioning. The beer was stronger in the evening. or at least the drinking was less restrained. Tomb paintings from elite contexts and a scattering of references from Deir el-Medina's own records suggest that communal drinking was common and that drunkenness, while not exactly celebrated, was not condemned with the severity a modern viewer might expect. A famous tomb painting from the 18th dynasty shows a woman at a banquet vomiting while a servant holds her hair. It is painted without visible judgment. In the Egyptian understanding of things, intoxication was associated with Hathor, with joy, release, the temporary dissolution of the boundaries that ordered daily life. Getting drunk was, in their framework, touching something sacred. Whether the Egyptians who got drunk on beer in a mud-brick village after an 8-day work shift experienced it in those cosmic terms, I have my doubts. But the cultural permission was there, and the beer was abundant, and the nights were long. Music. We know there was music because the instruments survive, and because tomb paintings depict musicians with an attention to detail that borders on technical illustration. Harps, tall, elegant, often played by women. Lutes with long necks and small resonating bodies. Double reed pipes that produced a sound archaeomusicologists have attempted to reconstruct, with results that are, depending on your tolerance for speculative acoustics, either haunting or approximate. Clappers carved from bone or ivory. Sistrums, the rattling instruments associated with Hathor's cult, shaken during both religious ceremonies and, evidently, more casual gatherings. One ostracon from Deir el-Medina contains what appears to be the lyrics to a work song, though whether it was actually sung at the work site or composed as entertainment in the village, no one can say for certain. And games. Senet boards are everywhere. Carved into stone surfaces at the work site, painted on wooden boards found in houses, scratched into limestone slabs that served as impromptu playing surfaces during breaks. The game was ancient even by New Kingdom standards, with origins stretching back to the early dynastic period. The rules, as far as we can reconstruct them from artistic depictions and a handful of textual references, involved moving pieces along a track of 30 squares, with the outcome determined by throwing sticks or knucklebones. In the Egyptian belief system, Senet carried afterlife symbolism. The board represented the journey of the soul through the underworld, and winning was associated with successful passage into eternity. On the rooftops of Deir el-Medina, it was also just something to do after dinner when the light was fading and the neighbor owed you a rematch. Now, and this is where the evening opens into something the textbooks handle badly. Love. Egyptian love poetry exists, not fragments, not hints. Complete poems preserved on papyri, the Chester Beatty Papyrus, the Harris Papyrus, the Turin collection, that speak about desire with a directness that startles people who assumed the ancient world was either prudish or crude. These poems are neither. They are sophisticated, playful, achingly specific. A woman describes her lover's voice. A man describes watching a woman bathe. The imagery is botanical. Pomegranates, lotus flowers, sycamore figs, used not as decoration but as a sensory language for physical longing. The speakers are young, lovesick, dramatic. They compare their suffering to illness, and given the actual illness rates, this comparison had a weight the poets may or may not have intended. Marriage itself was practical. No religious ceremony is attested for most of Egyptian history. A couple moved in together, merged their economic households, and were considered married. Divorce was possible and, at least in legal terms, remarkably accessible by ancient standards. Either party could initiate it. Property was divided. Children typically remained with the mother. Women could own property independently, could inherit, could conduct business, could testify in court. Legal documents from Deir el-Medina record women buying, selling, renting, and, in at least one case, hiring a male servant, which suggests an economic agency that the standard narrative about ancient women rarely accommodates. But, and I want to hold these two things in the same hand, legal agency existed inside a social structure that was profoundly unequal. A woman could own property, but her daily life was consumed by grinding labor that no man performed. She could initiate divorce, but her economic survival after divorce depended on the settlement terms and her ability to remarry or rely on family support. Cancels the other. The evening deepens, cancels the other. The evening deepens. The fires burn down. The children are gathered from the rooftop and the street. The oil lamp is lit, a simple clay dish with a linen wick floating in sesame or castor oil, producing a light so dim that modern experiments suggest you could barely read by it, though the Egyptians did. The shadows in a mud brick house at night, illuminated by a single lamp, would have been dense and close. And this is where belief saturated everything. The night in the Egyptian understanding of the cosmos was not simply the absence of the sun. It was an active state, a period when the sun, as they conceived it, descended into an underworld populated by hostile forces and traversed a perilous journey through 12 hours of darkness before being reborn at dawn. The world above was, during those hours, exposed. The protective canopy was gone. The forces of chaos, called Isfet, the opposite of Ma'at, the cosmic order that sustained reality, pressed closer. The dead were nearby. Spirits moved. The boundary between the visible and the invisible thinned. This was not metaphor to the Egyptians, not poetry, not cultural tradition drained of real belief. As far as we can determine from the weight and consistency of the evidence, most Egyptians experienced night as genuinely dangerous, a time when spiritual protections were not optional but necessary. The household shrine was tended. Prayers were spoken. Amulets were placed on children's bodies. Small faience figures of Bes, Wadjet eyes, Djed pillars tied on linen cords around the neck or wrist. Ivory wands were laid across sleeping infants, their curved surfaces carved with figures whose function, as the Egyptians understood it, was to create a defensive perimeter around the vulnerable. Spells existed for nightmares, spells for protection against scorpions in the dark, spells against the spirits of the dead who, in the Egyptian belief system, could return to the living with grievances, demands, or malice. The letters to the dead that I mentioned earlier were one response to this anxiety. When something went wrong in a household, illness, infertility, financial misfortune, one possible explanation within the Egyptian framework was that a dead relative was unhappy. The letter was an attempt to negotiate, to ask what was wrong, to offer remedies. One letter, written by a widower to his deceased wife, pleads with her to stop causing illness in the household. "What have I done against you?" he writes. "What have I done?" That sentence has stayed with me since the first time I read it, in a translation by Alan Gardner that I found in a university library when I was still young enough to think the Egyptians were exotic. They are not exotic. That man, writing to his dead wife in the dark, asking what he did wrong. He is one of the most recognizable human beings in the entire ancient record. His confusion is exact, his pain is specific, and the system he lived in gave him only one framework for processing it. The dead are angry. Find out why. Fix it. The weight of this, the cumulative weight of living inside a belief system that monitored not just your labor and your rations, but your moral standing in the eyes of cosmic forces that would, as the Egyptians believed, weigh your heart against a feather after death. This is the part of daily life that resists easy description. Ma'at was not an abstract ideal discussed by philosophers. It was a daily, practical obligation. To live in accordance with Ma'at meant to be truthful, to be just, to fulfill your obligations, to not cheat your neighbor, to not steal from the dead, to give bread to the hungry and water to the thirsty. The negative confession, the list of sins the dead were expected to deny before the divine tribunal, reads like a comprehensive audit of daily behavior. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not caused pain. I have not held back the water in its season. The Egyptians did not need police on every corner. They carried the surveillance inside themselves. The gods, as they understood them, watched. The dead watched. Ma'at watched. The heart, the physical organ which the Egyptians believed was the seat of intelligence and moral identity, recorded everything. There was no forgetting, no erasure, no escape into anonymity. The system saw you even in the dark, even alone, even after death. I think this is where daily life in ancient Egypt becomes both most alien and most familiar. The external structures, the rations, the work gangs, the attendance records, the corvée, those are recognizable. Bureaucracy is bureaucracy, but the interior dimension, the knowledge that your moral weight was being measured by forces you could not see, that your heart would one day be placed on a scale and your entire existence judged in a single moment, that is something else, something heavier, something that shaped how a person woke up in the morning and how they laid down at night and what they whispered over their children's sleeping bodies in a house lit by a single flame in a village at the edge of the desert. The lamp goes out, the oil runs dry, or the wick is pinched between two fingers. The house goes dark. The village goes quiet, except it doesn't. There are dogs and donkeys in their pens, and the wind off the western cliffs, and somewhere, always, the sound of sand moving against stone. Tomorrow the cycle resets. The grain is ground. The bread is baked. The men walk to the mountain or the men stay home, depending on the day. The scribe writes it all down, and underneath everything, beneath the bread and the beer and the labor and the law and the festivals and the love poems and the children's graves, the river. Moving in the dark, carrying silt from a place the Egyptians never saw toward a sea most of them would never reach. The river that built everything. The river that demanded everything. The river that did not care, though the Egyptians, in their worldview, believed it did, believed the flood was a gift from forces that could, if displeased, withhold it, and in some years did. The day ends the way it began. In the dark, in a house the state built, with sand in the bread and an amulet on the child's chest, and the sound, faint and constant, of the desert doing what the desert does, which is wait.